Lloyd's YouTube channel afterwards. You're welcome to look that up. We'll get it edited and up in a few days. My name is Laura Schmidt. I am the archivist here at the Marion E. Wade Center. I am also the proud staff advisor of the Wheaton College Tolkiens Society. So it's good to have you here with this co-sponsored lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Weber, who is Assistant Professor of English here at Wheaton College. Dr. Weber earned his master's and doctoral degrees from the Medieval Studies program at Cornell University and specializes in Anglo-Saxon scholarship. He leads a weekly Anglo-Saxon reading group here on campus that's been running since spring 2018. And just last semester, he taught an Anglo-Saxon class at Wheaton College, which, if it wasn't the first such class on campus, it is at least the first in a long time. So that's good. That class contained a group of very enthusiastic and appreciative students, some of whom I'll wager are in the audience today. Where are you guys at? Your own fan club right here. Dr. Weber has had a passion for Beowulf since he first read a children's version of it around the age of 12. Old English captured his interest as an undergraduate because, and I quote, he loved the way the words sound. He has a forthcoming essay on Beowulf in the journal Anglo-Saxon England being published this spring, and is currently at work on a book project that looks at the translation of poetry from Latin into Old English during the Anglo-Saxon period. Ask him for more details. Tolkien has entered Dr. Weber's life at a young age as well, when he first read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and he's returned to these stories a few times since then. He's also taught from and enjoyed Tolkien's essays and letters. If you haven't checked those out, I really recommend you do too. Given J.R.R. Tolkien's lifelong passion for the study of the Anglo-Saxon language and culture, I thought it fitting to invite Dr. Weber to give a lecture co-sponsored by the Wade Center and the Wheaton College Tolkien Society. I am thrilled that that lecture is happening today and look forward to his guidance on exploring this fascinating area of Tolkien studies with his talk titled, Caught in a Net of Words, J.R.R. Tolkien's Translation of Beowulf. Dr. Weber.
Hi, and welcome certainly to everybody. Let me express in my first place my very deep gratitude to the Tolkien Society, who are the sort of genesis of this, especially that subset of the Tolkien Society that was my first Old English class, which is a natural association that one ought to seek to cultivate. But also to the Wade Center, to Laura personally, who has done sort of wonderful things with my class when it came to visit, and to all of you who are here, students, colleagues, friends yet to be made, just for showing up and coming to hear what I have to say. So how to begin? Maybe with a paraphrase. I propose to speak about Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. If those lines sound familiar to you, right, you're not wrong. It's a rash adventure because many folks more learned than I have held forth on the translation since it appeared in 2014. Some indeed began to hold forth before it actually appeared in 2014. The situation as it stands now is much like the reaction of the Canterbury Pilgrims to the infamously disordered loves on display in the Miller's Tale. Diverse folk diversely they said. But more on the critics in a moment. Today I really want to start with the monsters, by which I mean the texts themselves. And there is the first page of the first folio of the Beowulf manuscript staring you in the face. And at this point it's probably fitting for me to offer a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a specialist in Tolkien. I've admired Tolkien for a long time, and Laura explained a little bit about that. First, for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Later, once I had begun my own studies in Old English, for Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, right, his seminal essay, and for Unfairy Stories, which, although it is not specifically about Old English literature, sort of illuminates many things about that literary tradition, as well as some of his lesser-known critical pieces, the essay on Síl in the Old English Exodus and things like that. Later still, and lately, I have come to admire him for his remarkable sensitivity to the formal qualities of older verse forms, a fineness of aesthetic judgment that sort of runs as a counterpoint to his incredibly rigorous philological arguments. about words and especially names. And if you've read the Finn and Hengist book, you know what I'm talking about when it comes to names, yeah. But still, I am an amateur, and I say that sort of in the truest etymological sense of that word, right? One who is a lover of, one who is passionate about Tolkien studies. So what I really am professionally, why I'm here is a medievalist, and indeed an early medievalist, someone whose focus is on, the 7th through the 11th centuries or thereabouts. I sort of, the boundaries change day to day depending on what it is I really want to talk about, but that's a good guideline. My own training includes some of the same ground that Tolkien covered in his literary explorations, and my own inclinations direct me towards some of the same objects, things like the Gothic Gospels, the Icelandic sagas, Gawain and the Green Knight, and most of all, Beowulf, that so exercised Tolkien during his lifetime. I too, as my students will attest, care deeply about the pulse and vitality of ancient and medieval verse. Reading it is one thing, but hearing it is another. And if any of my medieval Latin students are in the audience, you remember our class yesterday, yes, that's what I'm talking about. I've done my best, and here I'm borrowing another of Tolkien's famous formulations, to be sufficiently diligent in my special walk to make the claims that I'm going to make with confidence. But nonetheless, I welcome during the Q&A or afterwards the input of those who know more than I do about Tolkien's vast corpus and might be able to shed further light on the means and ends of his translation from that perspective. So with that disclaimer issued, let's get to the issue at hand. Tolkien made at some point in his lifetime a translation of Beowulf. We know, based on correspondence between him and Oxford University Press, that it was complete, which is to say he had actually translated everything, though not to his satisfaction. I mean, never to his satisfaction, if you've read Carpenter's biography or thought about Tolkien's publishing process. But he had completed the translation as early as 1926. We know, too, from Christopher Tolkien's own recollections that Tolkien had his son retype it circa 1940, and Tolkien subsequently corrected that typescript in his own hand. At a minimum, then, he worked on the translation over a span of about 15 years. In all probability, again, knowing what we do about Tolkien's working habits and penchant for perfectionism, it would have occupied him to a greater or lesser degree for like most of his adult life. And yet, unlike his translations of, say, Sir Orfeo or Gawain and the Green Knight, it was never published, or never published, that is, until 2014, when his son and literary executor Christopher published it as part of the ongoing series of Tolkien's posthumous works. And let me pause a moment, especially after that designation, posthumous. I've now mentioned Christopher Tolkien's name twice in this talk. I heard last week, I think on Thursday, that he had passed away at the age of 95, and read the modest obituary that sort of made it over to the US news outlets. I'm not really in a position to eulogize him properly. I didn't know him well or correspond with him or anything. But this project has driven home to me how very great a debt many of us owe to Christopher Tolkien. I have sometimes wished, I must confess, that he would have adopted a slightly different editorial philosophy, more footnotes, those sorts of things. But I'm nonetheless profoundly grateful to him for his stewardship of his father's papers, and for the tremendous labor he undertook in finishing so many of the projects his father was not willing or able or simply didn't have time to complete. As an admirer of Tolkien and as a student of early Northern literature, my life is richer because of Christopher Tolkien's work. Wel betham themot after death day drichten sitchen unto father fathmum fredo wilnian. Well it is for the one who may seek the Lord after his final day and ask for peace in the Father's embrace. Lines from Beowulf that I hope Tolkien was in the habit in his letters of sort of dropping in these untranslated quotations from Beowulf, and I hope those lines would seem fitting. But let's get back to our task, to the translation, having expressed gratitude simply for its existence. I want to begin by demonstrating something of the problem. First for Tolkien himself, and then for modern readers of Tolkien's translation. These are the famous first 11 lines of Beowulf. If you have taken pretty much any class with me, you have heard them. If you have taken English 215 here at Wheaton, you have heard them. If you are a Tolkien enthusiast, you likely have heard them. They only get better with age, so let me read them to you again. What? We gardene in jarda hun theod kuninga thrum jefrunen. hutha athlingus elden fremmeden, oft skyldskjeffing skjeven a threat og monigum meithum meod setloft her, edsore erlas sydd en ærest werd færsjæft funden, hedas frovri bad, werks under våknum, werthmundum fach, of that him ehults thara umsittender over hronrada huren shoulder, gomban yildan, that was good kuning. Right? That was a good king. Old English delights so many of us because it is simultaneously familiar and alien. Its cadences and its phonetic inventory are close enough to ours that we recognize them, but we never feel quite at home among them, though it's easy to believe that we could. What is very close to modern English what? But we would never shout what at a hall full of unruly thanes to get their attention. We can recognize other words here, kuning, dagas, moni, meod, king, days, many, mead, but they stick out among a series of words whose meanings are at first glance inscrutable. Fremman, to perform, oftean. That one actually is a little bit of a poser, even for those of us who are professionals. We think it means something like overthrow, but it's not very well attested in the corpus. Thrum, courage or strength. Jefrinen, to hear or to learn by hearing about. The whole feels recognizably English, in large part because initial stress, which is the tendency of the stress to fall on the first syllable of a word, except in compound words that are formed by prepending prepositions to other words, but for the most part, at the beginning of a word. And I should issue another disclaimer here that if you thought you were going to hear a talk about Tolkien's translation of Beowulf that wasn't going to get technical at some point, I apologize. I will do my best to make this as accessible as I can, but Tolkien's delight, my delight in older language, is so invested in the little things that it would seem wrong not to attend to them. So initial stress is a characteristic of all Germanic languages. I want to dwell on this idea for a moment because it strikes close to the heart of my theme in this talk. Understanding the characteristic rhythms of a language, not just in your mind, but sort of feeling it in your bones, makes a tremendous difference. Old English casts its peculiar spell on so many native speakers of Germanic languages, and those of us who are native speakers of modern English are part of that group, because although we don't know the words, even our first halting attempts to articulate it tend to come out pretty much right. We know how it's supposed to sound, even if we don't know what it means. But even so, it's more compressed. It means more in fewer words than modern English does. And in some ways, that is the crux of the translator's problem. If rhythm is central to the experience of the poetry, and translation naturally tends to disrupt the rhythms of the original, what does the translator do? Seamus Heaney, whose translation currently sort of reigns supreme as the favorite of scholars and amateurs alike, offers us one solution to this problem. This is his translation of these lines. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Sheafson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king. I will admit that "that was one good king" doesn't fall on my American ear, perhaps in the same way it did on Heaney's Irish ear, but nonetheless, that is one good translation. Heaney's achievement is remarkable. He's captured the rhythm and many other poetic qualities of the original while sticking very closely to the poem's metrical framework, and more on that later as we understand it. That approach demands that he take some liberties with the syntax, but very few have begrudged Heaney his adjustments. The result is both readable and beautiful, and may be the best introduction to Beowulf for anybody who is unable to read it in the original. Now, Heaney published that translation in about the year 2000 when I was graduating high school and learning to pursue my intellectual interests independently. And I remember this because I read it in its first hardback printing on the bus on the way to a field trip. I don't remember the field trip, but I remember Heaney's Beowulf. It's inevitable, therefore, that Tolkien's translation would be compared to Heaney's. And it bears remembering that Heaney was a Nobel Prize-winning poet before he published his Beowulf translation. According to the Prize's website, he won the award, quote, for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles in the living past. No small competition. in other words. So let's make the inevitable comparison. Here is Tolkien's translation. Lo, the glory of the kings of the people of the Spear-Danes in days of old we have heard tell, how those princes did deeds of valor. Oft shield-shifting robbed the hosts of foemen, many peoples, of the seats where they drank their mead, laid fear upon men. He who first was found forlorn. Comfort for that he lived to know, mighty grew under heaven, throve in honor, until all that dwelt nigh about, over the sea where the whale rides, must hearken to him and yield him tribute. A good king was he. This translation has its special qualities. There is a rhythm, though it can seem free at times. It improves when it's read slowly, as I tried to do. I do not recommend rushing through this translation. Because when you read it slowly, it's often exacting imitation of the cadence and syntax of the original come through most clearly. It has at moments an attractive gravity. It's not, in anyone's estimation, readable or accessible or any of the other adjectives we usually apply to, quote, good, and I want those scare quotes to be very audible at this point, translations. Critical opinions have, as I mentioned before, varied widely. In that way, Tolkien's Beowulf is not unlike Beowulf itself was when Tolkien found it, and wrote his somewhat infamous paragraph in The Monsters and the Critics about the confusing babble of scholarly opinions surrounding the poem. Tolkien, being a gentleman and a scholar, named no names as he gave his review of those critical positions, and so I will follow his practice here. First, we have an authoritative and friendly voice. Tolkien's prose Beowulf is a successful rendering of the Old English poem and provides both illumination and pleasure to its reader. Experience shows that when read aloud by a gifted speaker, some passages have great rhetorical and aesthetic power. Then a somewhat dismissive, if not exactly critical, voice. As for Tolkien, displeased with his Beowulf, he surely would have wanted more time to edit, more time to revise, but he had other things to do. A somewhat backhanded compliment, Tolkien's translation has its own spell, though its movement is more crabbed than that of the equally accurate version made by G.N. Garmansway in 1968. The felicities of Tolkien's version will be evident only to readers familiar with the Anglo-Saxon original. A harsh and scholarly voice. It was Tolkien who denigrated his translation, calling it an abuse and hardly to my liking. He left it behind and forgot about it. How does its unauthorized publication serve Tolkien's reputation? A sentimental voice, but one perhaps looking for an explanation of what has happened here. Perhaps in the dark of the night, he, that's Tolkien, already knew what would happen, that he would never publish his beautiful Beowulf, and that his intimacy with the poem, more beautiful, would remain between him and the poet, a secret love. Which is a kind way of saying that he never would have wanted to let it out the door, right? And finally, denunciation from the pulpit at a public lecture given by the current holder of the Rawlinson Bosworth Chair at Oxford, which is the same chair Tolkien held for much of his professional life. A horrible, horrible, horrible translation. He goes on to say in that same lecture that the commentary that comes with the translation is an extraordinary work of scholarship. And so, the lecture's not all critical, but nonetheless, that is a direct quotation. So what do we make of all this? The scholarly voices are perhaps predictably harsher than the Tolkien enthusiasts. Tolkien, and I say this from the perspective of a current scholar of Old English, was a frustratingly brilliant philologist who chose popular writing over scholarly writing. And his legacy tends to make specialists squirm in their seats, in large part because we need him. He fills our classes. He makes the strongest argument possible for our jobs, which matters deeply in the current market. And yet, right, he chose something other than what it is we spend our time doing. But even if we correct for that bias, there's a world of difference between a horrible translation and one that is illuminating and pleasurable, between a translation that is considered a success and a translation that is considered an abuse. It's important in the first place, I think, to put a finger on one problem with this criticism, which is that it tends to judge the translation a success or a failure without really considering what those words mean. What is a successful translation, right? What does it do? An excursus on translation theory is not really what I want at this moment, so it's not what I'm going to give you at this moment. But it is important to check our own sense of the purpose of translation against Tolkien's, especially since some of the harsher reviews claim that Tolkien himself regarded his translation very dimly, right, calling it an abuse and so forth. Happily, that's possible. He wrote several essays that touch on issues of translation about Gawain and the Green Knight, about Beowulf itself. And so we are able to look at the record of things that he's written and maybe get a sense of what he might have been after. With regards in particular to this claim that he called it an abuse, I think the source for that claim is actually his essay on translating Beowulf, which was originally part of a revision of the Clark Hall prose translation, I think, that Chambers undertook. And Tolkien wrote this essay sort of kind of defending the proposition of translating Beowulf into prose, and kind of holding forth on just simply the nature of translating older literature. That essay's been printed separately in the collection, The Monsters and the Critics, that Tolkien's estate put out, which is a really invaluable resource for this kind of scholarship. So I highly recommend it. I know it's in the reading room. And so if you're interested, get it, look it up, read the whole thing. And he writes this, right, to use a prose translation for this purpose, and in context, what he means by this purpose is as a substitute for the original, is nonetheless an abuse. And so that word is there, but doesn't refer to the translation. It refers to using the translation a certain way. Beowulf is not merely in verse, it is a great poem. And the plain fact that no attempt can be made to represent its meter, while little of its other specially poetic qualities can be caught in such a medium, should be enough to show that Clark Hall, revised or unrevised, is not offered as a means of judging the original, or as a substitute for reading the poem itself. The proper purpose of a prose translation is to provide an aid to study. And that, I think, is specifically important. Important, too, that he goes on to distinguish this use, right, as an aid to study from a crib, which was always a dirty word in my education, and certainly was in Tolkien's as well. Crib is the usual sort of term of abuse for a slavishly literal translation that is kind of a magic decoder ring for an ancient text, right? The thing that you can use in place of really doing your homework if you're taking a course in Latin or Old English or Greek or something like that. A crib is a crutch, but as Tolkien writes later on in the same essay, a good translation is a good companion of honest labor. I've included on this slide this excerpt from Tolkien's comments on his translation of Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a poem that I would love to talk about more, but won't for the sake of time. But those of you who are in medieval literature, you'll hear about it, yeah. Because those comments, along with actually the whole structure of his essay on translating Beowulf, point towards the two principal things that he considered when he was judging the enterprise of translation: rhythm, meter and alliteration, and lexis, the choice of one word to represent or stand in for another. Those are really the two major sections of the essay on Beowulf. But they also come up in his comments on Gawain when he says that what he values in his own translation is that in the first place it preserves the original meter and alliteration, and in the second that it's able to find an intelligible modern idiom that is nonetheless somehow faithful to what's going on in the medieval text. So if we're going to evaluate Tolkien's translation, if I'm going to add my own impertinent voice to the sort of babble of critics that I put up there before, I'd like to do so according to criteria that at least would have made sense to him. We're, of course, entitled to our own criteria and to our own taste. I'm not trying to persuade anybody to like Tolkien's translation if they've already decided not to. And I don't think I'm going to replace Heaney's translation with Tolkien's on my own syllabus. Nonetheless, I think it's a mistake to judge Tolkien's translation purely on its readability, which is usually the unexpressed criterion that lurks behind these reviews. I think that would have meant little or nothing to Tolkien himself. If the purpose of translation is to aid a student in the long, hard labor of coming to know the text in the original language, right? If a good translation is a good companion of honest labor, I don't necessarily think readability is an advantage. The difficulty of the translation may indeed have been part of its raison d'être. So what I want to do from here on then is examine these sort of two criteria that emerge from Tolkien's comments. In the first place, meter. How do we grapple with the meter of the original? And in the second place, lexis. How do we grapple with the vocabulary and somehow transferring that into modern English? And I want to start with meter. And as we do that, I want to point out in the first place that Tolkien's theory of how Old English meter worked is somewhat different from the prevailing modern theory. And I have expressed this prevailing modern theory many times to my students. And so even if you learn this from me, you'll want to pay attention here. And I think the following will illustrate the difference. A comment from Tolkien and a comment from an essay on the nature of Old English verse in the current edition of the Cambridge Companion to Old English Literature, which was sort of revised and updated in 2013. So let's start with Tolkien's theory. Old English verse is called alliterative. That is a misnomer in two ways. Alliteration, though important, is not fundamental. Verse built on the plan described above in the essay, if written blank, would retain a similar character. The so-called alliteration depends, apologies for the retyping there, not on letters, but on sounds. Alliteration or head rhyme is, in comparison with end rhyme, too brief and too variable in its incidence to allow mere letter agreements or eye alliterations. So two sort of things about alliteration here in Old English verse. In the first place, that it's actually less important than rhythm. And in the second place, that it's something that must be heard, and that our eyes, as we read it on the page, don't necessarily lead us in the right direction. And you can contrast this to Don Scragg's comments from the Cambridge Companion here, where he says most lines of Old English poetry contain two contrasting metrical types to mark the caesura, but unity is given to the whole line by the binding of the two parts with alliteration. And that more or less is the modern consensus on how Old English poetry works. Now, like all scholarly consensus, it is somewhat ragged around the edges, even in a field as small as mine. But nonetheless, the theory says this: every line of Old English poetry consists of two half-lines that are rhythmically distinct and maybe even contrasting, but are nonetheless united by alliteration. In other words, every line is under tension. It is pulled apart by the rhythmic contrast, but it is held together by the repetition of a particular sound. The forces have to balance, right, or it doesn't work. But for Tolkien, the forces don't balance. Alliteration, though important, is not fundamental. Rhythm actually is primary. And the rhythmic differences across the caesura didn't actually push the half-lines apart, but simply marked their distinction, just as, and this is his metaphor and not mine, separate bricks in the same wall. This from the Monsters and the Critics. The very nature of Old English meter is often misjudged. In it, there is no single rhythmic pattern progressing from the beginning of a line to the end and repeated with variation in other lines. The lines do not go according to a tune. They are founded on a balance, an opposition between two halves of roughly equivalent phonetic weight and significant content, which are more often rhythmically contrasted than similar. They are more like masonry than music. Judgment of the verse has often gone astray through listening for an accentual rhythm and pattern, and it seems to halt and stumble. If we follow Tolkien's line of thinking, we might, and the sort of rhythmic half-lines are the bricks in a wall, we might liken alliteration to something like mortar. It's helpful for keeping bricks together, but it's not really necessary if the craftsmanship is good and the stones are fitted together with care. That kind of procedure can produce a humble wall, like the low rough walls that you'll see dividing one pasture from another in rural England, and you will still see these today. But it can also produce monuments like the pyramids or Stonehenge, right? Eld ente Joerk, to borrow another of Beowulf's memorable phrases. And this, I think, is the most sort of lucid, the clearest summation of Tolkien's theory. And I think this point helps to illuminate one important feature of Tolkien's translation that is probably evident in what I read before, which is that it alliterates, but it does so somewhat sporadically. And that many of the revisions, if you read carefully the introduction to his Beowulf translation that his son wrote, many of the revisions which Christopher Tolkien describes his father having made actually reduce the amount of translation or amount of alliteration in the translation as a whole. That in a subsequent revision, he will take out some of the elements that would originally have alliterated. Not obviously because he didn't know that alliteration was present in the original, but instead, I think because he doesn't believe it's as important as many scholars of Old English literature do. The rhythm, by contrast, is perceptible throughout Tolkien's translation. Even the critics of his translation actually remark upon its distinctive rhythm. Although I think Christopher Tolkien might cloud the issue a little bit when he writes that the rhythm is, quote, present but not susceptible to analysis. As someone who is primarily a literary critic, I would argue that if something is present, it is ipso facto susceptible to analysis, and that indeed is what I am here to do. But, you know, I'm content to disagree with others who relate to literature in other ways. So I would contend then that Tolkien's translation is one way in which Tolkien's translation is useful is as an attempt to help readers grasp what is truly fundamental about Old English meter. And as evidence, I offer a passage of Beowulf that I have found delightful for the obvious joy that it takes in the play of sound at a moment when honestly almost nothing is happening in the poem. The Yeats are going to Heorot, right? Like they've landed and they're walking. And so again, I'll read it in Old English, and I've given only Tolkien's translation, and I will read that translation as well. Strat was stanfach, sti wisera gum at garra, guthbirna shan herd hondlocken, kring iren shir song in serum, tha hi to selle furthum, in hyre grure jertum gangen komen, setten same the side skyldas rondas rein herde, with das wretchedes well, bugen tha to benche, byrnen hringden, guthsero gumena, gara stoden samana sero samod at garra, ashholt uven grey, was se iren threat wapnen je worthed. And I think, well, let me read Tolkien's translation first, and then I'll go on to comment. The street was paved in stone patterns. The path guided those men together. There shone corslet of war, hard, hand-linked. Bright ring of iron rang in their harness. As in their dread gear, they went striding straight unto the hall. Weary of the sea, they set their tall shields, bucklers wondrous hard against the wall of the house, and sat then on the bench. Corslets rang, war harness of men. Their spears stood, piled together. Seaman's gear, ash-hafted, gray-tipped with steel. Well furnished with weapons was the iron-mailed company. And I think a comparison of these two begins to illustrate my point about meter. When we go back to the Old English with Tolkien's comments in mind, I find it easier to perceive the solidity of the poem's construction, the way that each half-line makes itself felt as an independent unit. Song in serum, the hier to selle furthum, in hyre grure jertum, gangen komen. Right? You can hear it. It fits together quite nicely. The strong stresses give the whole passage a regularity that draws the reader in, but also invites him or her to linger over individual images. And that imagistic quality of the passage is heightened by actually a very important fact about Old English poetry and the way that the Old English language works. It is preeminently nouns that land in the stressed positions in Old English verse, followed by adjectives and then verbs. There's a sort of hierarchy of what part of speech will take that stressed position. But because nouns are first on that list, Old English poetry is very much a poetry of things. It is a poetry that emphasizes concrete experiences and their descriptors, right? Nouns and adjectives. Take the first half line here, strat was stanfach. Literally, the path was made up of varied stones, although how exactly to translate stanfach is a subject of some consideration. That's not a very exciting translation. It's mine. I apologize. But it makes my point. Right? The strongest stress falls on the thing, the strat, the path. The second stress then falls on the adjective that describes its essential quality, which is expressed in Old English sort of with beautiful economy by a single compound adjective. Stan, the noun for stone, fach, which is an adjective that can mean a whole bunch of things, varied, variegated, different colored, spattered sometimes. You can be blodfach, which means that you've been spattered with blood, which, if you read the Grendel episode, there's a whole lot of that going on. But here we're stanfach, which clearly doesn't mean like spattered with cobblestones. But nonetheless, it's getting at some fundamental similarity in the sort of varied or variegated texture of the thing. There's a lot in that word. And this is the kind of thing that is so desperately hard to capture in a decent modern English translation. But the stresses fall on strat and stan, or the beginning of stanfach. They really emphasize both the object and its essential quality. So the hearer of the poem then is left with this concrete specific image, which is bolted solidly to the rest of the poem by those two strong stresses. And I think Tolkien's translation captures that quality well. He has diminished the role of alliteration in this passage, right? You can perceive it, but it's not fundamental. What gives his translation its solidity is its rhythm, which yokes nouns to other nouns or to adjectives in a series of discernible units, right? The street was paved in stone patterns. Tolkien has there turned one half line of Old English into two stress units in modern English, but the pulse is the same. And paved in stone patterns is as elegant a way to capture the real meaning of stanfach as any other I can think of or have read. That sense of solidity persists as we read the whole passage. And if we think about Tolkien's translation as a good companion of honest labor, we return to the Old English text better prepared to appreciate one of its distinctive qualities, how the meter works. If we see the translation differently, we'll come to a different conclusion. I cannot think of any defense of sat then on the bench that doesn't begin with the observation that sat then replicates the pattern of stress in the Old English in a way that the obvious alternatives then sat or sat do not. And Heaney in particular writes then collapsed on the benches. I could multiply examples of the foregoing, ways in which Tolkien's translation virtually begs to be read against the Old English, but I won't. I think especially with reference to meter, because the rhythm of the translation is, I think, the most obvious feature of Tolkien's translation, and it's one that even its critics have understood pretty well. Instead, I want to remark on the significance of the other choice that comes out in my previous example. Right? So Tolkien writes, sat then on the bench when the Beowulf's thanes sit down. Heaney writes, then collapsed. At first blush, what we have here is an example of Heaney following and Tolkien ignoring the first commandment of dramatic narrative, thou shalt use dynamic verbs. Anybody who's taken a basic writing class, right, you've heard this before. Collapsed captures the thanes' exhaustion after a long journey. They've sailed from Yeatland in a frightfully small boat, certainly by our modern standards, battling waves and weather and maybe sea monsters along the way. They've been questioned by a canny old warrior of Hrothgar's on the beach, and they have marched in full armor, and we know this because we're told about the way their mail harnesses are jingling, from the coast to the mead hall. So collapsed then seems about right. It's a long day. But there are other considerations in play. In the first place, collapsed is a Latinate word. From lapsare, frequentative of labor, meaning to fall or slip or glide or something like that. Sat, on the other hand, is a Germanic verb. Indeed, not just any Germanic verb, but one of these so-called strong verbs. These are verbs that make their past tenses by changing their stem vowels rather than adding an ed suffix. We often think of these verbs as irregular in modern English, but they are not. They were actually the regular series in Indo-European. What we now think of as regular verbs, the so-called weak verbs, were originally the irregular ones. The sort of long history of language is full of these ironies, and they are delightful. And the strong verbs are also the crowning glory of the Germanic morphological system. They inspire some of the same terror and wonder in students of Germanic languages that say me verbs do in students of Greek. If any of you have studied Greek, you know what I'm talking. I see a couple of people. Yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Dido me, tithe me, histe me. Yeah, if you've done your time, you know how that goes. So this is a special verb from an original Old English sitan, a strong verb, which is why it comes down to us even in modern English as sat and not sitted, which is what my daughters would say, right? But they're learning. Haven't yet explained all the strong verbs to them, but their time will come. Germanic warriors sat on benches long before they learned how to collapse from Virgil, Ovid, and Statius. Sat also replicates something of the semantic range of the Old English bugan, which is a pretty non-committal verb. It means essentially to move, and it can cover a whole wide range of activities. That range might include collapse, but does not entail it. Now, it behooves us all to remember that Tolkien was among the greatest Germanic philologists of his generation, and probably subsequent generations too, and so if I can explain this stuff to you, he was definitely perceiving it. So his choice of sat is defensible on philological grounds, right? We would expect no less. But that choice has another consequence. And this is a consequence that really illustrates my second main point about Tolkien's translation, and maybe the one that is actually the most fundamental, which is that it pushes us to reflect with very great care on the qualities, histories, specific meanings, possibilities of words we think we know. The above excursus is one example. To sit is a mundane activity, one not often worthy of comment. Yet, in an interesting way, to use such a prosaic word to describe the actions of Beowulf's Thanes can, if we allow it, spur us to reflection on the descriptive power that is locked up inside that little word. I sit at the dinner table, and sat then on the bench. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. That word can do a lot. Tolkien was more than aware of this possibility. He declared it, actually, at a point in his essay on translating Beowulf, when he says this: if you wish to translate and not rewrite Beowulf, your language must be literary and traditional, not because it is now a long while since the poem was made, or because it speaks of things that have since become ancient, but because the diction of Beowulf was poetical, archaic, artificial, if you will, in the day that the poem was made. I think it's important to note that Tolkien addresses the reader here directly as a potential translator. If you wish to translate, not rewrite Beowulf. This essay was published around 1940, so long after Tolkien had completed his translation, around the time when he was getting his son to retype it, so he's still actively working on it. That manner of addressing the reader suggests to me that Tolkien had a clear vision of the value such a translation, either the one he's talking about or the one he's making, might have, in contravention to those critics who believe that he saw his own translation basically as a failed enterprise or a waste of time or sort of a fruitless distraction from other things that he was doing. Nor do I necessarily agree with the sort of sentimental picture that this was a secret love of Tolkien's that is sort of too fragile ever to see the light of day. But notice second, and I think this is more significant, that Tolkien is most exercised at this moment, not actually by the project of sort of capturing Beowulf in modern English, but by ennobling modern English, by refining it via translation of great poetry. And that's where this second quotation comes in as he makes a more programmatic statement. This sort of thing, the building up of a poetic language out of words and forms archaic and dialectical, or used in special senses, may be regretted or disliked. There is nonetheless a case for it. The development of a form of language, familiar in meaning, and yet freed from trivial associations, and filled with the memory of good and evil, is an achievement, and its possessors are richer than those who have no such tradition. And at this moment, he's conceiving of this primarily as a lexical process, a process of sort of finding those equivalents, stripping of their familiar and mundane associations, recharging them with their original potential. This ought to sound like a really familiar idea at this point, at least to those of you who have read On Fairy Stories carefully, because it's the idea he chooses to call recovery in that essay. Here talking not about language, but about actual things in the world. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers. Oh, apologies for the omission there. Though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiares are the ones both most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces, and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their color, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring, ceased to look at them. And there's a wonderful modern English translation of an ablative absolute in that last. I mean, it's not even a translation because he just wrote this, but nonetheless, you can see the pressure of the older languages on his syntax even here. So at this point, I'm hastening to my end, and so I'll try not to belabor the point, but I hope the similarities between what I argue Tolkien is doing in his translation and what he's saying fairy stories do for us are apparent. Recovery addresses our need, the concept of recovery in this essay addresses our need to be freed from the tyranny of familiar things. The development of a poetic language, Tolkien describes in that other essay, addresses our need to be freed from the tyranny of familiar words. Both are part of a process of re-enchantment that allows us to see things as they are, and I will involve myself with the philosophers boldly. Charged with the sacramental force that inheres in all of God's creation. And this last is not my idea. I defer inter alia to the estimable Dr. Downing, who described Tolkien's project much in this way in the lecture that he gave last term. But I think the claim that Tolkien was recovering the English language through translating Beowulf is perhaps novel, and a claim that's worth entertaining, one that stands up to some pressure. And I will give you two pieces of evidence to put some pressure on it before I go. The first are Tolkien's words about language in his address, A Secret Vice, originally given at Oxford, published now in The Monsters and the Critics. And this is an address in which he talks about his hobby, passion, lifelong pursuit of inventing languages. He says, in the first place, I am personally most interested perhaps in word form itself, and in word form in relation to meaning, so-called phonetic fitness, than in any other department. And what he's talking about here is how the sound of the word sort of is bound inextricably to its meaning. Something that we know, doesn't hold true in all cases, otherwise a multiplicity of languages wouldn't be possible, and yet is something that Tolkien was deeply exercised by. But then this much longer quotation from later on when he begins to talk about poetry and connect this idea of word form to the creation of poetry. He says, in poetry of our day, when the use of significant language is so habitual that the word form is seldom consciously marked, and the associated notions have it almost all their own way. So he's talking about a poetry that's sort of very heady and whose specific sound quality isn't well understood or cultivated. It is the interplay and pattern of the notions adhering to each word that is uppermost. The word music, according to the nature of the tongue and the skill or ear, conscious or artless of the poet, runs on heard, but seldom coming to awareness. At rare moments, we pause to wonder why a line or couplet produces an effect beyond its significance. We call it the authentic magic of the poet or some such meaningless expression. So little do we ponder word form and sound music beyond a few hasty observations of its crudest manifestations in rhyme and alliteration, that we are unaware that the answer is simply that by luck or skill, the poet has struck out an air which illuminates the line, as a sound of music half attended to may deepen the significance of some unrelated thing thought or read while the music ran. Maybe not quite so simple as all that, and the sort of evolution of literary criticism from Tolkien's day to our own, requires further unpacking of these propositions. Yet nonetheless, Tolkien is onto something here, that word form and sound music are a fundamental part of poetry in a way that we aren't always ready to appreciate if we approach it sort of brains first, which I admit is something I'm often guilty of, in case you hadn't surmised that by the sorts of things I'm talking about. And in this essay, what's so interesting about it is that Tolkien regards poetry as the ultimate evolution of his linguistic inventions. And he expresses this conviction, right, that word form, the basic sound pattern of a word, has a fundamental relationship to a meaning, and that is something he pursued. Poetry then reaches its highest evolution when word form and sound music sound an intricate counterpoint to the play of conceptual meaning, counterpoint of which he suggests that we modern readers are generally ignorant. One solution was for Tolkien was to make languages in which that union could happen more easily than it does in ours. So what I really want to argue here today is that in his Beowulf translation, he's looking for a parallel solution to the same problem. A mode of using modern English in which denotation, connotation, what he sort of subsumes under the heading of notions, sorry about that. Denotation, connotation, and word history and sound music all work together, as they did in the poetry of long ago. I'm not sure he was wholly successful in this regard or consistently wholly successful in this regard, but I do think he found success in part. There are passages of his translation, and I've picked a couple, which when read slowly with care, charge even the humblest modern English words, right, sat, with gravity and significance. But I think that this process was also fruitful for him in other ways, and I will offer one, and this will be my last example. This is a passage from The Two Towers. As Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are approaching Minas Morgul. I didn't choose this at random, exactly. I sort of chose it at random, but only after I had checked to make sure it was representative of the phenomenon that I am trying to describe. Let me read this slowly. All was dark about it, earth and sky, but it was lit with light. Not the imprisoned moonlight welling through the marble walls of Minas Ithil long ago, tower of the moon, fair and radiant in the hollow of the hills. Paler indeed than the moon ailing in some slow eclipse was the light of it now, wavering and blowing, like a noisome exhalation of decay, a corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing. In the walls and the tower, windows showed, like countless black holes looking inward to emptiness. But the topmost course of the tower revolved slowly, first one way and then another, a huge ghostly head leering into the night. For a moment the three companions stood there, shrinking, staring up with unwilling eyes. Gollum was the first to recover. Again he pulled at their cloaks urgently, but he spoke no word. Almost he dragged them forward. Every step was reluctant, and time seemed to slow its pace, so that between the raising of a foot and the setting of it down, minutes of loathing passed. So they came slowly to the white bridge. Do you hear it? It sounds in places like the Beowulf translation. Only natural, perhaps, as they were written by the same author. But there are lines here in which, to borrow Tolkien's image, the bricks are perceptible. These individual two-stress units that go together to make up the larger whole. There's even some alliteration, lit with light, the hollow of the hills. But even when alliteration is not perceptible, we hear that rhythmic structure. Countless black holes looking inward to emptiness. The caesura falls after holes. The rhythmic association of inward and emptiness speaks volumes. We are seeing and hearing the recovery of modern English at work. I suppose I should conclude then by offering a final estimate of the translation. I don't think it will replace Heaney or even Roy Liutz's translation as a means of first encounter. It is not accessible. I concede that point. But it is, I think, well adapted for what I believe to be its purpose, and that purpose is a high one. So read Tolkien's translation if you're looking for freedom from the mundane uses of the English language. Read it to learn to delight most, and as you read it, learn to delight most in the things that are the most puzzling. Read it to learn that the sea is both a place where tourists swim and whales ride, that comfort is both a pair of slippers on a cold day and the bonds of friendship that redeem a childhood of abandonment and destitution. Read it above all as a good companion of honest labor, by which I mean read Beowulf in Old English. As it says in the Old English Maxims too, Gleomen shlum yedem rixlum, wise folks invest time in sharing stories. Thank you very much.
While we're thinking about those, I would like to start with one, if that's okay.
Sure.
We have on the cover of the Beowulf text, and Selich spell. And I wondered
yes.
if you could just mention what that is so that people would know when they're coming to the book.
Yeah, so there are many wonderful treasures in that translation that I didn't talk about. The commentary is one. The commentary doesn't stretch through the entire poem, but it's full of sort of really rich philological insight and is totally worth it. Another is the text to which Laura has mentioned, Selich spell, which is actually Tolkien's own prose account of Beowulf's youth, written in Old English. So be prepared. But it's really delightful. It's funny. There is this odd moment in the second half of the poem. So Beowulf has done great things in Denmark. He's slain monsters. He's amassed treasure. He's lost a man, but he's been compensated richly by Hrothgar. He sails home back to Jætland. And when he does, we're told that apparently folks back in Jætland had regarded him, despite having the strength of 30 men in each hand, as something of an unpromising youth. Now this is actually conventional. You find this in things like Grettir Saga and Egil Saga. You have these sort of outsized heroes capable of tremendous feats, who are nonetheless kind of lazy and difficult as young men. I suppose I sympathize. So Selditch Spell is Tolkien imagining basically the prequel to Beowulf sort of in the form of an Icelandic saga and writing it in Old English. And it's really delightful. It's just fun. Reading prose is an excellent way in any older language to really get your grammatical competence up because it's easier to parse the sentences and so on. So it's a good companion text to Beowulf in a number of ways, but foremost for the sort of sheer delight in the thing. The other text in that book that I would mention, and one of the reviews mentions this, is there's a lay of Beowulf and Grendel, which is written in the same stanza form as the Lady of Shalott, and replaces, so instead of the word Shalott, you get the word Heorot every time. And so it's, I mean, talk about the sort of re-enchantment or disenchantment or substituted enchantment. The kind of spell that text casts is very different than the kind of spell cast by the Lady of Shalott, because it's, Beowulf and Grendel wrestling instead of this sort of beautiful story of a woman who's hopelessly in love with Lancelot and dies because of her love. So there are some really wonderful, it's a book worth owning. There are some really wonderful things in there.
Thank you. If you have a question, raise your hand and let me come over to you, because since we're recording this, we definitely want your question to be in the microphone. So any questions?
Let's see if what I have in my brain is correct.
All right.
About 40 years ago, we visited the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I remember seeing was Beowulf. And it was not a copy of Beowulf, it was the copy of Beowulf.
Yep.
There's only one.
Right.
We could have lost it.
Indeed. Yes, that's all correct. The textual history of Beowulf itself is that there's one manuscript. It's Cotton Vitellius A15 is the shelf mark. It now lives in the British Library because the British Museum sort of divested its book holdings and those went to the British Library. It's very hard to get to see. It was damaged in a fire in the late 18th century. It was part of the collection of a fellow named Samuel Cotton, who was a great book collector, and so many of our manuscripts of Old English came through his library, lived in the sadly and aptly named Ashburnham House, which, like Heorot, awaited a barbarous burning, to quote from Heaney's translation of Beowulf. So there was a great fire. The Beowulf manuscript was damaged. It continued to degrade for quite some time. There are two early transcripts made by a fellow named Thorkelin, which are extraordinarily helpful witnesses to the bits of the text that were damaged and have now degraded to the point that we can't read them. The trouble with Thorkelin is that he didn't really know Old English. So his transcripts, though useful, are not flawless. There's another more careful transcript made later by I think by Junius, which is more reliable, but also, so it's a funny situation because we have one manuscript and yet multiple witnesses, because some of the other witnesses are transcriptions that preserve readings that are no longer legible. The editing of Old English texts, most of which survive in only one manuscript, is a sort of a fascinating and a fraught business. But you're right about the textual situation of Beowulf. So yes, we're awfully fortunate that we've got it at all. It's all right.
Oh, okay. When you were talking about the two different ways of thinking about how Old English verse works,
Yep.
I was wondering if those have different ways of approaching the idea of Old English that would have been primarily a language that would have been heard and not read.
Yeah, interesting possibility. So I do think, as far as Tolkien's comment that he would rather call alliteration head rhyme, and it's really sort of hearing the consonants of the first syllable of a couple important words, rather than, so often we say that alliteration is the repetition of a consonant at the beginning of a word, right? That's the sort of textbook definition you have to memorize in your English 215 here or whatever it is. And of course, when we say the repetition of a consonant, I mean, maybe buried underneath that definition is some phonological reality, the repetition of a consonant sound, but we tend to think of it in terms of letters. Whereas a hard C ought to alliterate with a K, and a hard C and a soft C shouldn't alliterate, and things like that. And so I think in one respect, yeah, Tolkien's idea that alliteration isn't quite what we think it is certainly rooted in the notion that Old English poetry is primarily heard and not read on the page. I think it is also perhaps true that whether you call it alliteration or head rhyme, it's easier to perceive when you're reading by yourself in a quiet room. And that if you imagine a sort of, somewhat rowdy oral performance, that what's really going to come through is the stress that the speaker imparts to different places in the line. And so that in some respects, maybe that is a helpful connection. That's not something I had thought on deeply before this, but I'm grateful to the question for sort of giving me a chance to think about it.
Thank you. As a complete illiterate in Old English, how does one learn it? I know, take a class. But if there aren't any classes available, how do you learn the pronunciation? Unfortunately, I love the way you read it. It made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I'm up there. How did you learn all that? I mean, how do you pronounce things that, to me, EA would be ea, but yet it would be ooh, or something like that, completely unrelated to what we're familiar with. How do you learn it without somebody who's versed in it to teach you? Or do you just kind of throw up your hands and say, okay, I'll just read the English translation in modern English?
Yeah, excellent questions, and I would never be one to advise throwing up your hands and giving up. I mean, one of the things that one learns from Tolkien's biography is that he himself was a phenomenal autodidact, and so much of his interest in the languages came from his efforts to learn them on his own. So I was lucky enough to have attended a number of schools at which Old English was a thing, and Cornell, where I did my graduate work, Old English was, if not the thing, one of the major things that one did. But, so that was how I learned it. At the same time, the internet has made many wonderful things, as well as many terrible things, available to us. So, choose what's wonderful, leave what's terrible. So a couple resources. Peter Baker's textbook on Old English is pretty good. As my students know, I teach it all out of order. But it's a good book that explains things at the sort of introductory level pretty lucidly. And what's really valuable about it is that getting the book entitles you to a code that'll let you get into a suite of exercises he's put online through his website at UVA, which will sort of drill you on the vocabulary and the morphology and all of those things. Old English is a fully inflected language like Latin or Greek, so you've got to learn all your paradigms and do all that fun stuff. So having a drill system set up is really great. As far as pronunciation goes, I know Mike Drought at the other Wheaton College, who is also really a sort of formidable Tolkien. He's the guy who edited the Tolkien Encyclopedia and that book called Beowulf and the Critics. He's done a lot in the field. He also at some point set himself the project of reading aloud in Old English, like the entire poetic corpus, and has put those recordings up on his website. So if you want an experience of how somebody, how a professional is reading it aloud, you can get all those recordings. So what I would always suggest is to get some kind of primer of Old English, and Baker's great. Read through the pronunciation section, and like 10% of it will make sense. And then listen to somebody read it. And then read the pronunciation section again, and another 10% of it will make sense. And to the extent that you're able to, come in contact with other people who are enthusiasts. But you can kind of train yourself to do it that way. It helps too to remember at the end of the day that this is a reconstructed pronunciation. There's no unbroken tradition of Old English that stretches from early England to the present day. There's an unbroken tradition of English, but not of Old English. And so, they're not guesses. They're based on pretty good linguistic scholarship. But nonetheless, there's some uncertainty, and there's a lot of regional variation. Glance at the dialect atlas of Middle English, and you will see the kinds of things that I'm talking about, right? So there are some things that are sort of up for grabs, different in the North and the South. But the sort of procedure I suggested will get you pretty far, even without a teacher.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So when you were describing how Tolkien thought that meter in Old English actually was, as opposed to how most people think, if I remember correctly, the quote said something about like balancing phonology as well as the rhythm. Was that?
Yeah, or the sort of phonetic quality, yeah.
Okay, so how exactly would that work? Is he like trying to match, I don't know, dentals with dentals, or like a certain length of sounds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm trying to decide how complex of an answer you really want, I guess.
Go for it.
One aspect of Old English metrics that honestly is a little bit more difficult is, so Old English does still have a notion of syllable weight or vowel quantity, whatever you want to call it. It's not as sort of at the forefront of the Old English meter, we don't think, as it was in Latin and Greek, but it's nonetheless still extant. And so the idea that in some sense a long vowel, or a syllable with a long vowel or a heavy syllable is kind of phonetically equivalent to two short syllables is, or something like that, is still perhaps operating. And so that's the sort of thing, if you look at late antique and early medieval grammatical texts, right, that argument that the long syllable occupies two morii while a short syllable only occupies one is kind of all over the place. And so it's a feature of older metrics. You've hit upon a subject of interest to me, so I apologize. So something of that may have been operating, and you can see echoes of it in, I mean, even as old as the sort of like high vowel deletion processes that give us certain words, but also, you know, from the descent from Germanic to Old English, but also in the, you know, why do you get syncopation in certain oblique cases of words, like you have Old English heoven, but which should be heovenum in the dative plural, but becomes heovnum a lot of times because we syncopate that vowel because we don't, it's too cumbersome, right? We've got to trim it down. And so those sorts of disparate evidence suggest that there is some notion that there's kind of there is some kind of, I hesitate to say ideal, but general sense about what a word length unit kind of feels like, how heavy it is. And I think the argument Tolkien is trying to make, and he's, you know, swimming much more deeply in these waters than I am, is that there is a kind of equivalence between the two half lines that in their sort of overall weight that comes out as a result of those considerations.
Okay.
Oh, the microphone's
It's
making its
slowly
way
going
back.
back.
Yeah. All right.
Any other questions?
We have
Did I miss
one
anybody?
up here.
Okay, great.
So does the choice of, it's not about Tolkien, but it's about Beowulf.
Yeah.
Does the word choice in Beowulf indicate whether or not it was work intended to be read quietly and alone, or intended to be performed?
That's a great question, and I probably can't give you a wholly satisfying answer. So that first word of the poem, right, what, we think is some kind of a marker of oral performance, or at least meant to evoke oral performance. It shows up in other Old English poetry, in the Dream of the Rood, right, what ich sedgen wilde swevne chust. And the sort of going theory about that word is that it's a kind of a call to attention. So it makes sense in the context of oral performance. So a word like that denotes at least a notional audience for the poem to be uttered aloud rather than sort of read in a solitary way. There is in Old English this kind of peculiar poetic vocabulary which manifests in certain words. You get edge as a metonymy for sword. So Old English, it's ECG, but it's equivalent to modern English, edge. You get that as a metonymy for sword, which makes sense, but it tends to happen in poetry and not in prose. So there is a sort of and that may be for reasons, that may be for metrical reasons or reasons to do with alliteration, that we need a larger inventory of particular words if we're going to sort of vary in the way that Old English poetry varies. So it might not be by itself a marker of oral performance, but it nonetheless seems to be associated with a poetry that seems very, very oral. The usual arguments about why we think Old English poetry is, if not always meant to be heard, at least coming out of a tradition where that was the norm, is sort of an adaptation of the arguments that like the Parry brothers made about Homer to Old English poetry, where you have the sort of the use of formulas, where you get half lines of the poetry repeated very often, The argument being that this stuff is composed spontaneously, orally, at least in its first instance. Of course, it's eventually written down. And if you are a shope, right, a maker of poetry, it behooves you to have memorized a number of formulae that work so that when you're composing your poem on the spot, you just sort of draw from your mental inventory of these things and stitch them together. And so usually the arguments about why it's not so much word choice, it's that kind of stuff. It's the structure of the poetry itself. On the level of the half line and sort of the verse, well, I mean, I would call it a verse paragraph, although of course they're not marked in the manuscript. But what seem to be the sort of units of sense in the poem.
So Beowulf is rap.
Something like that, yeah. I know nothing about rap, so I always feel bad about making those comparisons.
All right, one last question, and then maybe I'll have a final thought to ask.
Do you think Tolkien is suggesting by doing this translation that this is what students should do? They should read the original Old English and try making their own sense of it in writing?
I think that's, yes, in part. I think that's an excellent way to do it. And certainly, as I'm fond of saying to my writing students, you know, for all that you think you know how you would articulate something, if you've only thought it up until you write it down, you don't really know. Right? There's a kind of it acquires a solidity on the page that doesn't have otherwise, however clear you think you are. One thing Tolkien does say that I didn't quote on the PowerPoint is that one of the best uses for a translation of this sort is actually an exercise for correction. That the way for the student to use it is to read it alongside the original and to try to fix the translation where it inevitably goes wrong. And so there is, you know, he's imagining kind of engagement in writing there, not necessarily producing it in writing yourself, but actually going to the translation and engaging with it kind of dialogically, trying to hash out, like, how could I do better? Or maybe it's not a question of doing better in some abstract sense, but where would I change the emphasis? Because that lets you figure out where the poem strikes you most powerfully, what your vision of the poem is, and that is an eminently useful thing.
I have one last question for you, which I hope is a good takeaway for everybody. You've obviously devoted a lot of study to Old English, Anglo-Saxon, other languages. Tolkien obviously devoted a lot of study to these things. What would you say is a really good takeaway or reason for that study, rather than just pure interest and love of the subject that we could all latch onto as we leave here today?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm trying to think of a relatively simple answer that isn't flippant, you know, labor is its own reward or something like that. So I guess I would offer two answers. One is more pragmatic, the other more personal. The more pragmatic one is that I think there's no better way to exercise your mind than in the study of really complex languages. And these older languages, right, fully inflected languages, are wonderfully complex in the best ways. They fit together in ways that our language doesn't, so they're very different. But I don't think older languages only are in bounds here. One of the sort of delightful parts of my college experience was taking a year of Chinese, and I was fascinated by it because morphologically it's really simple. Like, you learn a word and you know the word, and that's great. But then the syntax does a lot, and if you want to learn the writing system, you know, you need to put in some time. But it's an incredibly worthwhile endeavor. It sharpens your mind, it broadens your appreciation of the world in tremendous ways, and the ability to go to a foreign country and speak the language is not nothing. So I was lucky enough to do French from when I was very young. I don't study it actively. I occasionally use it in my scholarship. But to be able to go to France and still speak the language, yes, it's obvious I'm an American. At the same time, I can get around. That's a very great gift. The more personal answer is that there's a conviction that many medieval grammarians had that the intricacy and the love with which God ordered the universe is perceptible in the system of Latin grammar. And for me personally, I mean, as a professor at Wheaton, where my faith commitment is no secret, that too is part of it for me. that to study language really deeply and understand not just how one language works, but sort of how it's embedded in a longer history of language, how it collides with and wraps itself around other languages, how it finds expression in literature, in myth, even in pamphlets and technical manuals, is an incredible thing that I think really is one authentic and powerful way of pursuing a closeness to God.
Nicely said. Thank you so much, Dr. Young.
Thank you.